welcome to Environmental Laws, Thompson Hine's Environmental Law Podcast. In each episode, you'll hear from subject matter specialists at Thompson Hine and sometimes special guests on current events and hot-button issues in environmental law topics covering land, air, water, and safety, laws. I am Tanya Nesbitt, a partner in Thompson Hine's Environmental and Product Liability Practice Groups, and I reside in our Atlanta office. I'm also a co-leader of the firm's Greenwashing Defense Litigation team. While I regularly handle all types of environmental law, I specialize in environmental litigation and ESG litigation. In today's episode, we will be discussing greenwashing. Here to join me in this conversation is Dr. Christian Braneon, Head of Climate Justice at Carbon Direct. Welcome to the podcast, Christian.
Thank you. So pleased to be here today.
Before we start, I just should give a brief introduction of all of your amazing accolades. So Dr. Christian Braneon is Head of Climate Justice at Carbon Direct, and he leads the integration of environmental and climate justice into Carbon Direct's culture, operations, and services across the carbon management industry. He also co-leads the Environmental Justice and Climate Just Cities Network at the Columbia Climate School, and serves as co-chair of the New York City panel on climate justice. In addition to all of that, he sits on the board of directors of the Trust for Governors Island, as well as the advisory board for Morehouse College's Environmental Justice and Sustainability Program. But before joining Carbon Direct, Dr. Braneon served as a climate scientist at the Goddard Institute for Space Studies and as co-director of the U.S. EPA's inaugural Environmental Justice Academy for Community Leaders. His work on urban heat and climate change have been featured in broadcast and print media outlets such as CNN, CNBC, and Science. Dr. Braneon received an AXA Award for Climate Science in 2021. And I just have to point out that Dr. Braneon has a Bachelor's of Science from Morehouse College, a Bachelor's of Science in Civil Engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology, a Master's of Science from the Georgia Institute of Technology, and a PhD from the Georgia Institute of Technology. And I am very happy that he has chosen to join us here to talk about, I think, a topic that we are both very passionate about. And so to kick off the discussion, Dr. Braneon, can you talk a little bit more about your role as Head of Climate Justice at Carbon Direct?
Absolutely. It's such an honor to serve as the first ever Head of Climate Justice at Carbon Direct. It's an amazing place to work because our science team includes dozens of brilliant earth scientists and geoscientists, as well as a variety of folks with expertise associated with fields such as policy, engineering, and even carbon markets. In my current role as head of Climate Justice, I'm taking advantage of all my experiences and expertise related to climate science, community organizing, and social justice to really sharpen the firm's thinking as it relates to environmental and climate justice. I've been charged with the task of leading the integration of environmental and climate justice into the firm's culture and operations, as well as its services across the carbon management industry. In my first 18 months, I'm particularly proud of what I've been able to contribute in terms of advancing thought leadership as it relates to how carbon project quality intersects with environmental and climate justice. But I'm also really proud of how the firm has advanced its internal anti-greenwashing focused client screening and how we've begun to integrate environmental justice information such as metrics into Carbon Direct software platform, and how we have strengthened and deepened environmental and climate justice related services, such as training for clients.
Yeah, that sounds like really awesome and important work. So much of what you do is interrelated and intersects with so many vital and important issues, particularly in the ESG space. But for our audience, there's often confusion about what EJ and climate justice mean. Do you mind defining the terms and explaining whether they're interchangeable?
Sure. I don't think they can be used or should be used interchangeably. I think people do try to use them interchangeably, but I think of them as, certainly related. There's definitely overlap, but there are some clear distinctions to me. Environmental justice addresses the equitable distribution of environmental benefits and harms, the ways we benefit and the ways we are harmed by our environment. And it also addresses the meaningful involvement of all the stakeholders in environmental decision making. And so a key question is whether local communities can influence the design and implementation of projects. And if they can influence the design and implementation of projects, how exactly? We're often concerned with how pollution is distributed in space in conversations about environmental justice. That is to say, we might seek to understand whether some communities take on an unfair share of pollution. And so assessing environmental justice or injustice is often a data-driven exercise, or at least it should be a data-driven exercise. One of the classic examples of environmental injustice in the US is related to the siting of landfills in my hometown of Houston, Texas. By analyzing the location of landfills and the socio-demographic characteristics of the communities associated with the landfills, it was shown that predominantly Black neighborhoods were taking on a disproportionate number of landfills. And further, if you had cited the landfills based on transportation infrastructure or even the relative affluence of the neighborhoods, for example, if you simply targeted the poorest neighborhoods, the landfills would not have been overwhelmingly cited in Black neighborhoods in the way that they were. Climate justice, on the other hand, responds to the disproportionate impacts of climate change on low-income people and marginalized communities around the world, the people in places least responsible for climate change. And it's important to remember that anthropogenic climate change, climate change caused by humans, is really only possible because of the Industrial Revolution. And there is no Industrial Revolution without resource extraction from regions around the world that were colonized. There is no Industrial Revolution without the extraction and enslavement of humans. Further, there is no Industrial Revolution without the land dispossession that occurred in what we now call the Americas and in other places around the world. So when we think about the climate crisis, it's important to remember that the root causes are closely linked with the exploitation of indigenous people, as well as colonization, and really a collection of supporting racist ideas and policies are what create the conditions that make the Industrial Revolution even possible.
Okay, that is a pretty comprehensive answer. And so for those of us who are engaged in the work of trying to create internal, whether it's corporate policy or policy more broadly in community on trying to sort of ameliorate and plan for the impacts and effects of both environmental and climate justice, we talk often about things like stakeholder management and value chain. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of these concepts from an industry perspective and how they work more broadly in terms of mitigation efforts?
Yeah, I can give some perspectives, particularly related to the climate tech space, climate tech investment. Many investors who focus on climate finance are motivated first and foremost by a sense of fiduciary duty when they make their commitments. When it comes to managing their long-term risk-adjusted fund returns, they see climate change as a great risk, but they also see investing in the climate transition as a source of great potential opportunity. And in this space, though, we need to break the feedback loop that's created by climate risk. Right? This feedback loop is fueled by the systemic risk that climate change places on GDP. There are estimates that there'll be a 10 to 20% permanent hit on GDP from unmitigated climate risk. And as we think through the vehicle of systemic risk to total GDP, we can clearly see the holistic risk that climate change has on all our investments in total. And so many investors believe that leaning into the green economy rather than anchoring being insistent on anchoring on the economy that we're leaving behind will add and protect future generations to come. In order to manage the systemic risk we're facing, system level engagement will be required, working across stakeholders and the broader ecosystem to drive the changes we need to see on the ground. We really need the system itself to evolve, our systems themselves to evolve. We need our energy systems to evolve. We need the climate finance system to evolve. Working with companies across the value chain to make commitments to climate transition planning and engage in procurement of green products across the supply chain is one means of us really changing the system or pushing for the evolution of the system. Another key aspect is government relations and policy engagement. And so at Carbon Direct, we're seeing three key inflections that are unlocking the potential for mainstream climate solutions finance. Their demand, policy, and innovation. On the demand side, we see now nearly 10,000 companies pledging net zero under high ambition standards and pathways. In terms of policy, there's this rise of regulated disclosures and taxonomies.
Right.
We now have countries representing 90% of global GDP that have pledged net zero. And lastly, the third important point is that the cost of climate solutions for managing carbon is going down thanks to innovation as well as economies of scale and falling costs for renewable input. So in terms of reaching net zero, these are the three key inflection points, that I'd like to offer today.
And so you talked a little bit about policy, and obviously here in the U.S. maybe at a key inflection point in terms of the world of mandatory disclosures and seeing many states either take action like California or other states like New York who have pending legislation. And this week, obviously, we got the SEC's climate disclosure rules, and so a lot of companies, whether you're publicly traded or not, are going to begin to think about material risk and what does that look like in terms of climate-related risk. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on what material risk to companies, assets, or communities related to environmental justice and climate justice may look like currently.
Yeah, well, one example is that there can be significant political exposure and sometimes community resistance associated with siting infrastructure or building facilities that may be critical to the success of an investment. Meaningful community engagement is well worth the resources it requires when construction permit delays or not getting your permit at all could be the alternative when you need to site infrastructure or build facilities that are important for your business or your investment. And so I think companies are finding that it's vitally important to fully understand any safety concerns expressed by local communities because they are the experts on their communities, and they may be aware of risks that are not obvious to folks less familiar with local politics, less familiar with the local weather, ecosystems, and community dynamics. Another example relates to the risk of social or environmental harm. Project developers sometimes face financial responsibility requirements around any necessary corrective action and site closure activities, as well as emergency and remedial response activities associated with a given project to ensure that these activities will be conducted without the cost being borne by the public. So I think the political exposure is really a material risk, and really just the potential financial responsibility, is a material risk for companies.
Right, and that segues so beautifully into our topic, greenwashing, because I always point out in sort of framing the topic that with greenwashing, right, a lot of the risk is reputational, and I think we're seeing obviously increased regulatory and litigation risk. But I wanted to give you the opportunity to really define what greenwashing is in the context of your work and the role that it plays, or you see it playing. The landscape is shifting.
Yeah, it's very big topic in the carbon management space. At Carbon Direct, we're really focused on making sure we're helping folks take authentic action to address the climate crisis. I would say that greenwashing is essentially any type of false or unsubstantiated or outright misleading statement or claim about the sustainability of a product or a service. It covers a real range of marketing missteps, including use of slightly vague or poorly defined terms. It's saying all the right things but failing to deliver. It's when folks misrepresent corporate climate action. They're portraying an environmentally friendly image, but the action isn't there. They're presenting misinformation, sometimes even unintentionally, and this could be damaging to brand reputation and certainly harmful to the planet. And so there's growing contempt in the public against companies engaging in greenwashing and even just companies being accused of greenwashing. And so measuring and reporting a company's impact has proven to not be enough for business or for the planet. You really have to do a good job with how you describe in your marketing and in everything you put out to the public what you're actually doing, because you can damage customer trust. But with smart engagement with public and really thoughtful approaches to marketing, you can also attract a lot of positive publicity. You can enhance employee engagement. And so in our work, we want to understand how folks intend to use carbon removal credits. And we're doing our own client screening so that we don't take on reputational risk by providing services for folks that want to misuse carbon removal credits.
So often I hear in my work from companies that oh, we don't have to worry about greenwashing because we're not selling a product to the public, and so we're not marketing to consumers directly, and so we're fine. And I just wanted to really differentiate here sort of the risk from specific product claims, obviously, but that risk is different when you talk about broader sort of societal benefits. How do you think companies really should approach those two things and work to avoid blind spots for either?
Yeah, well, I think to avoid accusations of greenwashing, it's key for companies to present clear messaging. They need to be transparent. Transparency comes up quite a bit in the carbon management space, for example. And a way to do this practically is to employ and utilize reputable global reporting frameworks. Don't just come up with something while you're eating a bagel in the morning as your means to report how you're approaching sustainability. Use reputable and global reporting framework. That way, the information that you share around sustainability is standardized and comparable, and it really needs to be in alignment with mainstream best practices. And so I have seen folks argue or ask me, hey, can I say that there's these broad societal benefits to anything associated with carbon dioxide removal or carbon capture, utilization, and storage? And I generally push back on that and say you really need to be showing folks what are the tangible, immediate benefits from this carbon project in terms of jobs created, in terms of enhancement to ecosystem services. How are you prioritizing marginalized populations? How are you ensuring that the local community can actually get these jobs? How are you aligning workforce development with your hiring? And just, at a broad level, how can the community inform the design and implementation of the project so that there's meaningful benefits to the folks living right around that carbon project? And so anyway, I think that at a high level, using reputable global reporting frameworks is key. And then also making sure that the folks that are in close proximity to project meaningfully benefit and implementing those projects in a way that creates equity in society, creates a more equitable society.
Yeah, and earlier you'd mentioned the anti-greenwashing client screening, right? So that the company, I guess, is not aligned unknowingly, perhaps, with those that may be sort of at risk or in a blind spot for greenwashing concerns. But I think what you later described seemed to be more of an in-depth assessment, if you will, of sort of where the client sits with respect to both any specific or sort of broader societal claims about carbon removal or management it may be making, really in marketing, or I mean, these things could appear in ESG statements. They could appear on the side of a truck, right? It could be also on social media, right? Anywhere that those statements may be made. And the importance of doing that assessment really on a continual basis, right? It's not just a one-time or once-a-year opportunity. The last thing I wanted to ask is we hear obviously a lot these days about AI, and I'm often asked questions about sort of what role is AI going to play perhaps in worsening or maybe mitigating the practice of greenwashing. And so obviously we're sort of early in this journey, but I wanted to get your thoughts on how you think AI may be able to help or may harm us in combating greenwashing, particularly in carbon management work.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had the answer for you. I think that AI really just reflects the values and assumptions that humans hold. I think AI could be used to worsen the practice of greenwashing. I think it could also be used to mitigate the practice of greenwashing. And we have started at Carbon Direct developing AI tools to help us screen clients, which has been extremely helpful for us. We're using natural language processing to analyze content that we find online or in sustainability reports and press releases. I imagine that folks could also use AI in other ways. Certainly there's ways though that folks could use AI to enhance their ability to practice greenwashing, right? AI could be used to develop more convincing and deceptive narratives that kind of fool the public into thinking that a company is doing much more than they are. I think folks could use AI to even counteract software that's looking to detect greenwashing, right? So I think the jury's still out, but at Carbon Direct,
Agreed.
we're excited to use AI to help us screen and understand the reputational risk associated with certain companies.
Well, Dr. Braneon, thank you so much for joining me. It's always a pleasure. These are very meaty and important issues, and really we could do an episode for probably more than an hour on any one of these topics, be it environmental justice, climate justice, or greenwashing, because there is always so much to unpack. But I really appreciate your thoughts on how all of this important work intersects, particularly in the carbon space. And thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Environmental Laws with Thompson Hine. I hope you found the information shared during today's program valuable. We welcome your questions about today's topic as well as your suggestions for future programs. You can email me at tanya.nesbitt@thompsonhine.com. If you would like to learn more about Thompson Hine's environmental group, please visit our website at thompsonhine.com. With approximately 400 lawyers in 8 offices, Thompson Hine is a full-service business law firm recognized for innovation and client service. Our Smart Path approach provides clients with services that are predictable, efficient, and aligned with their short and long-term strategic goals. This podcast is for informational purposes only. It provides general information and not legal advice or opinions regarding specific facts. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute this podcast without permission.